So now we're all set up and ready to go. I do want to get into and actually conclude this lecture series today. But before I do that, I just want to note for a moment what happened this last week. And I know there's a lot that happened this last week, and so you got to wonder what I'm speaking about. But I want to focus in particular on the Supreme Court decision in Trump versus Anderson. And I know that was 5 days ago. It seems like a long time ago, but the idea that the third section of the 14th Amendment will not disqualify Donald Trump from being on the ballot in any state for the primaries or the actual election for the president of the United States in 2024. I think this is the conclusion, the outcome that almost everybody expected, and in a sense, I agree from a purely political perspective that the scenario of nine unelected officials, or maybe a majority, but a split decision from the court, taking away perhaps the leading candidate for the presidency right now, certainly the leading candidate for one of our two main parties, would have been a real constitutional crisis, a real conflict between our courts and our electoral democracy. And so, judged from the basic perspective of the outcome, this is not a bad outcome. It's probably the only outcome that wouldn't have created major stress and perhaps conflict within our society. Um, but and here's what I want to get to: the actual holding of the majority, right? The five justices who authored the main majority opinion in this case strikes me as really very problematic. And so the holding is that in order for Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which uh, excludes from national major office persons who have previously taken an oath to uphold the Constitution and then either engage in or aid and support an insurrection against that Constitution, that that provision, right, um, the majority held, can only be enforced by an explicit act of Congress. And I just want to start by noticing how peculiar that finding is, in the sense that there are so many other amendments, almost everything else in the Constitution that the Supreme Court claims direct authority to interpret and enforce. On this one provision, they're saying, well, no, we're not going to touch it. Let's let Congress handle it. And I want to be as clear as possible. I think there's a rationale for this decision, which is that if they hadn't held this. And by the way, please note what the alternative is. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, but I'll reiterate. The alternative would have been that we don't want state courts litigating this issue, despite the fact that Article 1 gives the states the power to regulate congressional and national federal elections. We don't want one state's courts making this decision for the entire country. That seems to me to be a valid concern, that this is one of those areas where the Supreme Court has to balance different provisions with the Constitution and try to harmonize them. And so the alternative would be to let federal courts handle this issue, because it is, at least in large part, a federal issue. And then ultimately, this issue could come to the Supreme Court, not in the guise of Colorado has prevented Donald Trump from being on the budget on the ballot, but that a federal court has held that Donald Trump cannot be on the ballot in this or that state. And then the Supreme Court could determine whether or not that case was correctly decided. It would be complex. Did Donald Trump engage in or aid and support insurrection? is the presidency covered by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment? And this would be the way in which other complex constitutional legal issues are decided in our society. Why foreclose in advance a adjudication of this issue as opposed to make it only Congress that can determine the procedure via which Article 3 of the 14th Amendment can be resolved. And I want to say, well, one reason is because the Supreme Court doesn't want to handle this. The Supreme Court does not want to be in the Bush v. Gore position again of essentially deciding a national election. And so, as opposed to just saying Colorado can't do this, let's also say the courts can't do this until Congress acts. It relieves the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary of the responsibility of adjudicating a deeply political question. And the courts do have a tendency to, they actually have a doctrine, political questions doctrine, to say when the question is explicitly political like this, it should be handled by the political branches, not by the judicial branch. But having said that, then I want to note, and we've talked a little bit about this, that there were briefs filed by historians who looked into the context in which the 14th Amendment was written, and in particular, the intent or the reasoning that informed the drafting and ratification of the third section of the 14th Amendment, and that it was precisely meant in the way that other articles of our Constitution are meant to protect the integrity of constitutional democracy in moments where politics, majority rule might threaten them. That this was meant to be a form of the way in which one of these amicus briefs puts it, constitutional self-defense. Don't put in the position of power to potentially undermine the Constitution someone who has already displayed a willingness to go against the Constitution. And so, in the name of avoiding political questions, the Supreme Court has, in fact, um, removed one of the critical provisions of constitutional self-defense from the Constitution and from the system that typically protects the Constitution, the federal judiciary. And to be as clear as possible, the justices of the Supreme Court do not live on Mount Olympus or a space station or some completely isolated bubble. They go home and watch the news and read the newspaper and live in our society like the rest of us. And so they know that the prospects for Congress in 2024 passing legislation to clarify who is and isn't prohibited from occupying federal office on the basis of this provision of the Constitution is zero or less than zero. So, what they really did in this decision is basically say this provision has no effect. They all but excised the third section of the 14th Amendment from the Constitution, made it toothless, made it such that precisely in the circumstances where it would be activated, it will never, in fact, be enforced. And so it worries me in two respects. One of them I'm going to call the benign interpretation of what the court just did, and that would be it recognizes that it's still licking its wounds from Bush v. Gore, right? That the last time it got involved in a presidential election, it paid a heavy price in terms of the institutional legitimacy of the court. And so it is unwilling to further diminish its legitimacy by further wading into controversial political issues in 2024. And that may be actually an accurate political calculus, but I think it's also a problematic indication of the way in which a court diminished by its previous actions is incapable or judges itself to be incapable of performing some of its essential duties. And so I want to point to the fact that it's not just Bush v. Gore. The last time the Supreme Court got pulled into a presidential election, it is, of course, Dobbs v. Jackson. It's the fact that this court has an aggressive, supremacist, conservative, originalist supermajority that is using its power to fundamentally alter the meaning of the Constitution in ways that are rejected by stable majorities of the American people. It's not just political questions that have diminished the court's legitimacy. It is the direction that the court is moving in. And remembering, of course, that is it 6 out of 7 of the last presidential elections, the winner of the majority vote has been a Democrat, right? In 2 of those elections, the Electoral College delivered the presidency to the Republican candidate who won the minority of popular support. The result of that, plus various contingencies and Mitch McConnell's shenanigans in blocking Barack Obama's appointment of Merrick Garland to the court, mean that we now have 6 members of the Supreme Court appointed by a party that's won the popular vote only once in the last 6 cycles. And that's just a way of indicating that the current ultra conservative originalist supermajority is out of step with many Americans in terms of their views of what the Constitution means. They're enforcing their views on voting rights, on gun rights, on abortion, on issues to do with the scope of the power of the administrative state. And as they do this, they more and more undermine the legitimacy of the court, which is increasingly perceived by many Americans to simply be another partisan institution. And the result is then when they actually need their legitimacy to perform a core constitutional function, they may be incapable of doing so. That, by the way, is what I'm calling the benign interpretation. The malign interpretation, and I don't want to suggest that this is necessarily the right interpretation, certainly not of all 5 justices who signed the concurrent, I'm sorry, the main opinion in this case. Um, but we should recognize that this is not the only time that issues to do with the 2024 election are going to end up in the Supreme Court. Obviously, there is another case, Donald Trump's claim to complete immunity for anything that he did while in office, that is going to end up in front of the Supreme Court at the end of this current term. Some people worry that the court has, in fact, slow walked this case. I don't think that that is ultimately going to be that beneficial to Donald Trump, but one way of making sense of the timing in which this case will be heard is to say that there were justices who wanted to slow this down on the thought that it might benefit Donald Trump. Again, this is an interpretation for which I have no evidence, but this is the nature of the court. We very rarely have evidence of the motives of the justices other than what they write in their opinions, and we have to wonder how much of their actual motivation do they choose to reveal to us in their opinions? Having said all that, the malign interpretation is that there are at least members of the court who want to use their power to influence the outcome of the 2024 election. And I just think, given the messy collision of law and politics that we have in this particular election, with the leading candidate of one of our two main parties having been indicted multiple times, going to be on criminal trial. Is it once or twice or three or four times over the course of this election? It's entirely unclear, but I think it's quite likely that it will be at least twice. The courts and our electoral politics are inseparable. And we really need a court that doesn't just appear to be above the partisan fray of electoral politics, but that has the capacity to serve as a more impartial arbiter of some issues that have partisan overtures, but also constitutional dimensions. And ultimately, a court that has the legitimacy to perhaps do unpopular things. And I worry that what we see in Trump v. Anderson is the court lacks the legitimacy and perhaps the impartiality that is increasingly perceived as, in part because it's increasingly acting as a partisan institution. So, of all the things that happened in the news this week, and certainly there were plenty, I wanted to focus on that for a minute because it seems to me that that might be the most consequential. I do want to get into these. The conclusion of this lecture series we've been working on for a long time, but I do want to give you an opportunity to respond to or discuss these issues as well. The issue to do with Trump v. Anderson. So I'll pause for a second. Does anybody have a thought or a question or a comment or a disagreement about what we've just been talking about for the last few minutes? All right. I'm not seeing anybody raising their hand or unmuting themselves or waving at me, so I'm going to just jump right back in. And if something occurs to you, by all means, feel free to interject whenever you would like, as always. So we have been talking for weeks now about this issue that some economists refer to as the curse of wealth, the idea that in the 21st century, our economy grows, produces jobs, increases its productivity only at the expense of also increasing inequality. And that in the 21st century, the benefit of increased jobs, increased wealth, increased productivity is outweighed by the harms of increased inequality. We saw yesterday that the economy added another 250,000 odd jobs, an incredibly robust level of job growth. We recognize that we have really one of the healthiest economies in the developed world, and as the macro numbers report, we have inflation. It looks like under control, jobs growing, economy growing, and yet Joe Biden, the president who has presided over this really quite remarkable period of economic resilience in light of a pandemic and the strong headwinds it generated for our economy, is the least popular incumbent at this point in his presidency of any modern president. And my suggestion is maybe that's unfair, or maybe that is simply a reflection of the fact that the contemporary economy, even when it's humming along, generating jobs, growing, increasing in its productivity, is not translating into well being for average Americans. It's not just unfair. It's not just, the way in which the media is shaping the narrative, or the fact that the impression of Biden was formed in the first 2 years of his presidency, and he's turning things around later. Maybe it will be that he'll start to get credit for some of this, and that it will improve his approval rating and his standing in the polls. But maybe it's time to also start reckoning with the possibility that these macro metrics for judging the economy don't capture the lived experience of working and trying to survive in this economy. That the good news about the economy is not good news for many Americans in light of what it means to work in this economy, what it's like to try to make ends meet in this economy. We've looked at the fact that we have growing inequality for over 50 years now. We've looked at the fact that our economic well being in our society is really quite abysmal given the tremendous wealth of our society. We've looked at the fundamental explanatory variable offered by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett and a variety of other economists, which is that in a high inequality society, status anxiety is very high. That undermines self worth. It's not just that a lot of people have been rendered precarious. That is absolutely true. That 50% of our population is basically fighting an uphill battle to acquire any net worth whatsoever. It's beyond that. It's what living in a high inequality society does to our social psychology. It makes us much more anxious about our relative standing, which can undermine self worth. And so the basic conclusion here is that you're better off in a low inequality society, even if you are considerably less wealthy than you would be in a high inequality society. That if the price of wealth, once you get to a certain level of affluence, $20,000 per person per year, is increased inequality, it's a price that's not worth paying in terms of public health, in terms of social well being, in terms of individual status anxiety. And our economy is one of those economies where we're purchasing wealth at the expense of greater inequality, and it's not a winning proposition. I'm going to focus for a second on what this does to children, and I'm going to start with what it does to the parents of children. And the reason is, as I hope, remember from our conversation from last week, I'm trying to focus on values we can all share. And when I say all, I recognize, and we need to recognize, that we are hyper polarized by our partisan differences. And any policy that we consider that comes to us as a Democratic policy or a Republican policy is going to automatically attract the hostility and mistrust of roughly half of our population. And that makes it very difficult to pass legislatively. And therefore, we should be looking for points of agreement that escape the partisan binary of contemporary politics. One of those points of agreement I'm going to assume is that we should be concerned about the well being of our children. And here, the finding that the parents of children who have a high school degree or less are experiencing economic stress at nearly double the rate. Actually, it looks like it might be more than double the rate that they were experiencing it 40 odd years ago, 50 years ago, right? The well educated parents are also experiencing more stress, maybe even close to twice as much stress. but it's much more pronounced with the parents who have the high school degree or less feeling economic high levels of economic stress. 50% of them, almost at some points 50% of them, and we know what this does to their capacity to parent. And so even if we aren't concerned about them, if we think they have made their choices and they deserve their economic fate, obviously I don't agree with that proposition, but some of us do. Do we believe that the sins of the parents should be visited upon the children, that the children should suffer because the parents have not been sufficiently productive or made smart decisions? I'm going to assume that we, for the most part, don't believe that we believe that children should have decent well being in their childhood. And in fact, we recognize that this is part of what is necessary for them to become functional, productive adults and to not reproduce a cycle of inequality or poverty. We've looked at this multiple times before, that a more unequal society has low levels of economic mobility, that the rungs are farther apart on the economic ladder. The result is that it's harder to climb up, but also that parents spend more trying to confer advantages on their children. Again, this is driving child well-being down. Living in a more competitive society, kids get more pressure earlier in life. Parents are more concerned with their child's competitive position, less concerned with their well being. And we're seeing this, for instance, in a crisis of mental health with young adults in the United States. Again, this is stuff that should concern us as a society, irrespective of our particular view of distributive justice. And so last week I suggested, and we had a robust conversation of values that might inform our starting point for this discussion. And again, the strategy here is to move not from a diagnosis directly to a prognosis, not from we have too much inequality, what kind of policies should we use to combat inequality? Because to do that threatens to fall right back into the trap of hyperpartisanship, which essentially means that the likelihood of legislative success is very slender at best. Let's start by trying to construct a shared basis for justification, things we can agree on, and then move out to policy questions. And as will be clear in the remainder of the talk today, what I believe we should do then is be humble and experimental, gradual and iterative, as people tend to say, in our approach to policy. Let us not assume we know in the 21st century what kinds of policies we should embrace if we want to do more to increase equality, to decrease financial and economic vulnerability and precariousness, to decrease status anxiety, ultimately, because we haven't tried to do this in a concerted way for at least 50, 60 years. Our economy is a very different economy today than it was the last time we tried to do this. Let's be modest. Let's figure out what we want to do and then acknowledge that we don't know exactly how to do it and start experimenting as opposed to trying to prevail with a kind of arrogant certainty that we know what works. So I reordered the values to try to get them in the order that I think indicates their level of acceptability. Can these values serve as the basis for a consensus in our society in a way that might turn down the temperature a little bit on our partisan disputes on these issues? No excessive social inequality, not none of the kind of inequality that leads to the corrosion of trust, cooperation, well being, and solidarity that's bound our inequality. We're not aiming for equality, but we're aiming for bounded inequality, maybe of the kind that we had in the middle of the 20th century, looking at the evidence that that was a much more cooperative, collaborative, bipartisan, trustful, solidaristic society. Can we get back to that place? Don't we want to live in that kind of society? Aren't we persuaded by the evidence that an unequal society is bad for all of us? Second of all, every person should have basic economic security. We are the wealthiest society in the history of the human species. Should we have 40 million people living in poverty, regularly being evicted, often ending up homeless despite the fact that they have jobs, children not getting enough calories to flourish on a regular basis? And when I say children, 20%, 40% of our children, right? Being in poverty, being hunger insecure. These are things that it seems to me that if we step back from the partisan polarization, all of us should recognize this is just not the kind of society we want to live in. And then add to that, we want meaningful, equal economic opportunity for all persons. We want to have the American dream not just be a nostalgic wish for a society with greater economic mobility, but an actual reality. We recognize not only is that good for all of us, it incentivizes us to work hard, it's good for our society. It allows us to make sacrifices for the future and to have faith in our institutions. Third, we want non-domination. And this is, I think, fundamentally about not having concentrations of wealth that are so extreme that they allow the owners to exercise disproportionate power over the rest of us, whether that's politically, right? The indication that it's 41 individuals who provide 40% of the dark money that enters our politics that increasingly determines the outcome of our elections. That simply means we're not a democracy anymore. And we are, in fact, being subject to the will of these very powerful individuals. Similarly, economically, we want meaningful economic freedom, the ability to have a good idea, start a company, and have that company have some prospect for success. When we have to compete with Amazon, when Amazon basically steals almost all of the good products that are marketed on their platform because we have no alternative but to use their platform, we're no longer able to use our economic liberty to pursue our wealth. We want not just jobs, but good jobs. And I think this is the fundamental thing lacking. Biden actually did address this a little bit in his State of the Union address. One of the things we'll talk about next week. He spoke about the fact that the jobs that are being created by the Inflation Reduction Act are unionized jobs, are six-figure jobs, are jobs that come with educational benefits, health benefits, etc. And so how many of the 15 million jobs created by our economy in the last 3+ years as we've rebounded from the COVID-19 recession, how many of those jobs are good jobs? And I think what we would find if we looked carefully is that it's actually a small minority of those jobs. And that what we want is not just jobs, but jobs that come with respect and dignity, that come with benefits and stability, that have regular hours, that are not gig economy or contingent jobs, that in fact allow people to exercise a little bit of autonomy and creativity within the workplace. certainly not jobs that make us appendages to handheld computers or machines. Finally, we want a society without systematic status subordination, whether that's to do with race and ethnicity, national background and language, gender or sexuality, or region or education level. And again, I think listing the full list of ways in which our status markers inhibit our equality economically and politically helps us to see that it's not just Democrats who are concerned about this. Yes, they tend to be more concerned about race, ethnicity, immigration status, gender, sexuality, but there are also Republican or red versions of these concerns, geography, education level, and that in a sense there's a common unifying principle that might give us a little bit more sympathy toward each other. So, as I say, we had a robust discussion of these proposals last week. I now want to pivot from this basis and my claim here, my speculative, admittedly optimistic claim is if we shifted our conversation, our economy isn't working for us, isn't making enough of us happy, secure, healthy in the 21st century. And as opposed to what's the policy to fix the economy? What are the values that we want to inform our economy? What is a democratic political economy, an economy that supports democracy in the 21st century? We might just find that we have more in common than we realize, that our partisan divide has as much to do with identity as it has to do with value. There's some support in the opinion research that we exaggerate our disagreements. Let's try to turn it down a little bit and look instead at what we can agree on as value propositions. And if we can succeed in that, then transition into the policy conversation that doesn't just jump right back to, okay, I'm glad we had that conversation about values. Now, here's my policies, and they haven't changed an iota from what they were before we had that conversation. If so, people will begin to doubt the sincerity with which we tried to explore value agreement. So, my proposal is that as opposed to saying immediately, I know what proposals work, we take a much more cautious, modest, experimental approach. We don't know what works. We know Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal brain trust didn't know what was going to work in the 20th century as they tried to use for the first time the power of the federal government in economic policy to address a major depression. We are not in exactly that circumstance, but we are in the circumstance where if we're trying to get inequality under control in a 21st century economy, it's a new project. Let's be suitably modest about recognizing some things have worked in other countries, some things have worked in certain states or municipalities, but we got to figure out, will they work here? Can they be scaled up? Let's start allowing and supporting, funding and enabling cities, states, regions taking experimental approaches to trying to create good jobs, trying to reduce poverty, trying to create housing security, trying to prevent children from experiencing hunger or food vulnerability and see what works. We need to rigorously compare, we need to benchmark, we need to figure out which policies are working and evaluate them to determine whether they will or could work elsewhere, or there's something idiosyncratic explaining why they work in this region or this municipality. So having said that, I want to also suggest that we should concentrate on what we consider to be not only our most urgent problems, but the problems where we have the clearest consensus and agreement. And so I'm going to continue. I've put some ideas on the board, like um, decreasing child poverty, supporting good jobs for everyone, of supporting affordable housing, making sure that people are not bankrupted by unexpected medical expenditures or evicted or lose their housing as a result, make education more available to all persons. I am going to return for a moment. And when we looked at this slide in a slightly different context a couple weeks ago, to the work of David Leonhardt and Robert Putnam. And both of them, in different ways, are interested in the history of the middle of the 20th century. And they use different approaches. Leonhardt is more a narrative historian, Putnam is more a quantitative political scientist. But I think there's a common thematic to both of these works that's expressed in Putnam's overall synthetic graph, which suggests that growing equality in the economy in the middle of the 20th century was accompanied by growing cooperation, collaboration, bipartisanship, comedy in our politics in the middle of the 20th century, was also accompanied by a greater coming together as a society, more participation in voluntary associations, in unions, greater stability from our families, greater attendance of religious institutions and civil and civic associations, and finally was accompanied by cultural changes that resulted in a culture that expressed greater solidarity, commonality, sympathy, compassion. And so to recognize, and again, I think the lesson to be taken away from this is that there's no one lever to pull, no one silver bullet to fire at the inequality of the 20th century, and that we cannot do this by policy alone. Part of the reason to be experimental with policy is to let people in different regions tackle this problem in the way that seems to them to be most promising, most productive, in the hopes that this might have not just political and economic, but also social and cultural consequences. If we begin as a society to say, in the 21st century, we want to do more to tackle the problem of inequality. We don't know exactly what works, but that doesn't prevent us from experimenting. That's not an excuse. And by the way, we're going to try each and every way and then try to learn from each other. That will have not only policy and economic implications, but also social and cultural implications. Having said all of that, I want to return to, well, a diagram I've shared with you before, but it's been a year or longer. One of the things that Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, noticed about America and noticed about the way in which it operated. He believed we were a more equal society than the society of France, which he had left to come here to visit. That the fact that we had greater economic equality, in part because we were expropriating land from Native Americans, taking it in order to allow those who were less well off to have equal economic opportunity, gave rise to a normative expectation. We want to be treated as equals. I don't care that you currently have a lot more wealth than I do. I don't care that you're currently employing me. I'm not going to defer to you. I'm not going to treat myself as a permanent subordinate, and I don't expect you to treat yourself as my intrinsic superior. For all I know, you started life just like me, poor, working for somebody else, and you made it. I intend to make it as well. Please don't treat me as a subordinate, treat me as an equal. And that leads not just to a change in the culture, greater respect for the intrinsic equality of all persons, but also to equalizing reform. Let's change our tax code. Let's change our inheritance law. Let's change our voting rights to reflect the fact that we live in a society where everybody regards themselves fundamentally as an equal. And then, by the way, once we've changed inheritance and tax law, that may further solidify our equality. As opposed to that, what we've seen in the United States for the last 50 odd years, many other places as well, are some vicious cycles. This is a virtuous spiral. The idea that we have become more unequal in terms of income and wealth, and then become more unequal in terms of our political influence. And that in turn has led to revisions in the tax code, anti union legislation, uh, housing zoning legislation that makes it more difficult for middle class or poor people to gain access to the neighborhoods that have the best schools, further exacerbates our political inequality. And then you maybe, if I was better with my graphics, would have an arrow circling back, right, to indicate that this is a self reinforcing process. Similarly, as access to valued resources and social goods become more scarce, we become less cooperative, more competitive, and that in turn undoes our capacity to pass laws and policies that tend to ameliorate the scarcity. Therefore, the scarcity gets worse. Therefore, the competition increases. Again, now we're in a self reinforcing vicious cycle in which inequality is feeding itself. I want to suggest that, in essence, what Tocqueville saw in the United States in the 1830s, a virtuous spiral of growing equality, is what Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal, the United States, and many other societies produced also in the middle of the 20th century. But here the process was more complicated because it was recognized we don't have land to go west and conquer and then produce economic opportunity for with anymore. We, as opposed to that, have an industrialized economy in which robber barons and monopolies and highly concentrated wealth actually threatens to undo our normative expectations of equality and our institutions that further equalize us. So, as opposed to just simple reforms like reforms to inheritance law or the tax code or the qualifications for voting, we need more complex policy that creates countervailing institutions that directly counteracts the forces that tend to generate inequality that are intrinsic to our economy. We were already there, in other words, in the middle of the 20th century, and we had all kinds of policies, pro union policies, affordable housing policies, education opportunity policies, in a less successful way, affirmative action to address inherited status inequality for African Americans that ultimately produced for a while, roughly 30 years in the middle of the 20th century, a virtuous feedback loop that equalized our society. And we need to be looking at this as a blueprint for our long term efforts. As we experiment to figure out what works, we need to be thinking about which of the various experimental policy regimes might be incorporated into a 21st century equalizing policy loop. And here I want to focus in the first instance on a natural experiment that we conducted just in the last few years that might open our eyes to new possibilities for reducing poverty. And so I want to start just with a little bit of background here in terms of poverty rates to notice, and I think the most illuminating graph is to look at it by percentage. We have roughly 40 million people who are officially poor in the United States. Please note that just a few years ago, it was upwards of 45 million people. In other words, as I've said before, the population of a mid sized European country. And note that this is not a generous poverty threshold. This is an ungenerous poverty threshold. These people are extremely poor. Trying to support a family of four on 13 or $14,000 in the United States, it is what accounts for our very high rate of eviction, our very high rate of food and housing vulnerability, the fact that families are presented with impossible choices about whether to pay medical bills or put food on the table. Having said that, like I say, I think the more illuminating diagram has to do with the percentage of the population. And as you can see, and I think this is extremely important to notice, that the percentage of Americans who were poor from the late 1950s through the late 1960s was halved. It was cut in half. This is the Great Society programs, particularly championed by Lyndon Baines Johnson. They succeeded and succeeded quite dramatically. Ronald Reagan was fond of saying that the Democrats declared war on poverty and poverty won. That is half true and half false. The half that is false is to suggest that these policies had no effect. These policies cut poverty in half. That is a major victory, and we should recognize that, celebrate that, and want to learn from that. The part that is true is that once poverty had been cut in half, it stabilized and has been stubbornly persistent in the 10 to 15% rate ever since then. And again, I don't think we should be reconciled to this. I don't think that there's any reason to believe that we've reached the limits of policy. As a matter of fact, recent experience teaches us we could do much better than that. And before we move into how we could do much better, let's just note, right, that the single age group with the highest rate of poverty is children. 20% of children in the United States today are poor. One in five. Please note also that the number one group used to be older adults, that the combination of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and forms of housing support for the elderly drove elder poverty down at the same time that childhood poverty came up. We've, through policy, have changed the nature of poverty. Just want to remind you very quickly, we've looked at this together before. A lot of my information here is being derived from Matthew Desmond's really important work, Poverty by America, the claim that poverty is not just lacking resources, lacking money. It has multifaceted dimensions to it. It includes pain, incarceration, depression, addiction, housing instability, fear, humiliation. And so we need to make this concrete in order to trigger our compassion. I think we've gotten so used to living in a society with so many vulnerable people. We like to keep them out of sight, to dehumanize them, because frankly, it's hard for us to bear exposure to people who are immiserated. It brings out the negative side of sympathy, which is we end up putting ourselves in their situation and feeling badly. We insulate ourselves, many of us do, against that. We should do the hard work of extending our compassion to those who are suffering in our midst on a more regular basis than we do. When we do that, we should also notice something that I think is incredibly important. This data is a little bit different from the diagrams I was showing you before, but closely related. These are 3-year percentage changes in the poverty rate in the United States. And what you can see is that the rate of poverty is being driven down in periods in which there is economic growth, but we have economic cycles, right? What goes up must come down. The fact of the matter is that our long periods of economic growth are typically followed by hopefully shorter recessions, and that during the recessions, poverty goes right back up. And so that stable range of poverty between 10 and 15% of the population is being explained by the fact that essentially what we're relying on to reduce poverty is the economy by itself, and the economy doesn't do very well um, to uh, permanently reduce poverty. But look for just a moment at 2021. And here, what I want you to see is that in 2021, poverty was driven down by almost 4 times the amount of any other year in the last 50 years. And the way we drove poverty down in 2021 was not through economic growth, but through public policy, in particular, the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, which were incorporated into the American Relief Act, into the anti COVID legislation. And the consequence of these direct transfers to many Americans, not the stimulus checks, which were, basically a nice shot in the arm for consumption, but regular monthly transfers to families with children of $400 to $600 a month per child was to radically reduce child poverty, also reduce adult poverty, also reduce elder poverty. Poverty for all races and all regions of the United States was dramatically reduced. And by the way, we implemented this just a couple years ago, which means we could implement it this year, next year, easily. The policy framework, the infrastructure is already in place. By the way, there's growing support for this, returning this, making this permanent. You may have heard Joe Biden put this in his State of the Union address. The House of Representatives passed a bill that proposes to do this a month ago. There is support for this from both parties. This is something we could do quick, fast, and it would immediately take effect. If you're worried about what this would do to economic incentives, please note that the people who received these benefits continued to work and used these benefits almost exclusively for the things we would want them to use it for: food, utilities, rent, clothing, educational costs, not for recreational goods or luxuries, right? And so this policy works, and we could use it to immediately do a lot to reduce poverty in the United States. I want to say more. I think I am out of time. And so let me just point to the deeper, more difficult, more important conversation that we need to have as a second conversation, one that would hopefully build off of success in reducing poverty, maybe making affordable housing more readily available, maybe making people less vulnerable to unanticipated healthcare consequences. Remember, right, and I'm going to go back for a second, right? We've got this idea of gradually self reinforcing processes. If we get a little bit more equal, we may get a little bit more cooperative politically. We may have a little bit more solidarity with each other. And then, and only then, I would suggest we might try to tackle some of the bigger issues. And I think systematic tax reform should be top of the list, strengthening unions, creating greater equality of opportunity. Those should all be right up there as well. So to give you a sense of the approach that I'm suggesting we take, that I hope helps to account for it a little bit. Um, I lost my ability to see you, get right back into this and open things up for discussion. Who wants to start us out? I can see you again. Go ahead, Flossie. Remember to unmute yourself, please.
I worry about seeing an immigrant population from Mexico and other parts of the world trying to find a landing place, a place to live and breathe. They're out there. What do we do with them? Can we turn our backs on them? Can we say, as Vice President Harris said about a year or two ago, don't come, don't come, wait, don't come. We can't say that anymore. They are coming with their children, with their poverty. What do we do? Will you have given us a possible scenario? You've left them out, not because you're indifferent, because they're out there, and we don't have anything to say to them except wait. We will see that you land. We will help as much as we can, whatever that means.
And I have to say, Flossie, one of the organizations that I try to send my students to work with here in New York, because New York has become perhaps the largest single destination place for these migrants because they're being shipped here by the governors of Florida and Texas, is an organization that greets them at the train station or the bus station and just assists them, just welcomes them, just says, look, we have some resources with churches, with housing, with food, and we want you to not feel like this is a hostile welcome. Let's get you some humane treatment. And by the way, it's a remarkably successful organization. Um, but I'm gonna move away from the basic humanitarian impulse that you are articulating so well, Flossie, and transition to a little bit of an economic perspective here for a moment. And I think it's worthwhile noting, yes, we have a crisis. And the crisis is that we don't have the infrastructure, particularly at the municipal level, but also at the border, to process, to accommodate, to handle the influx that has been coming the last couple years. And these are record levels of immigrants. But having said that, I think we also have to recognize that the economic analysis of their impact on our economy, on inflation, on wealth creation has been a very powerful net positive, right? That the argument is that the contribution of recent immigrants to the American economy should be measured in the trillions of dollars, not the billions, but the trillions, as much as maybe $2 trillion. That part of the reason that we've been able to get inflation under control more quickly than other societies is because migrants have helped us to address the COVID created labor shortage. And so the idea that these are needy people who cost our society money. And I want to be as clear as possible. I think is at best half the story and a highly distorted one-sided narrative about immigration. The way in which this narrative is propagated, and it has become incredibly powerful politically, has to do with the fact that many people are looking for a scapegoat. Many people are looking for someone to blame for the inequality and precariousness that our economy has generated for so many Americans. And that the idea of being able to point your finger and saying it's these immigrants from South America that are taking your jobs, that are driving your wages down, is an incredibly convenient story to tell for people who are unwilling to consider policy that might actually make people less precarious, right? Blame them, not us, is in essence, I think, the hidden logic of anti immigration politics in the 21st century. And there is an element of truth in it. Some sectors of our economy have seen their wages decreased by immigrant competition, but the overall benefit is clear. And you add to that, and I think this is absolutely essential, that compassion, humanitarianism, justice, international law require that we accommodate these people if we can. And that points to the need to have a more complex narrative, a more complex frame for thinking through these issues. But that will only succeed if we can succeed in making people less precarious. We were more generous when it came to civil rights, when it came to women's rights, and when it came to immigrant rights in a period in which more people in our society felt more economically secure. We need to get back to that place, and then we can be more generous.
Thank you for letting us know that New York is being so active and
Yeah.
that people to greet the immigrant population from the South in
Yeah.
Manhattan.
Oh, yeah.
That's wonderful and
And
it's hopeful. The
yeah.
next thing that I would like to suggest is that we do something to get rid of it's too much to ask, to do something to bring about more recognition from the countries that suffer from lack of drug control, indifference the to the poverty and the really ugly um, the way children are used to be abused.
Yeah, and to be as
Yeah.
clear as possible, Flossie, what we're seeing in the 2020s, which is creating a crisis at the border, is creating real strains on the infrastructure of, for instance, affordable housing in places like New York City and Chicago. That this is the tip of the iceberg for what's
Yes.
coming, right? And climate change, the Department of Defense and the United Nations suggests will generate billions, not millions, but billions of refugees in the second half of the 21st century. And those people are going to try to be getting into the societies that have greater wealth, but in particular also greater order, greater functioning infrastructure. And by the way, the areas in the world that are not being overwhelmed by climate change. And so we're just beginning to reckon with what is going to be one of the most urgent problems of the 21st century. And simply accommodating growing waves of refugees and migrants on our shore in a just and humane way is not going to solve the problem. You're absolutely right that this is a foreign policy issue. This is a development issue. This is also a climate crisis mitigation issue. and not for today, Flossie, because we've got at least two other people trying to get in, and I myself have a plane to catch later this afternoon. But to be continued. Okay, David, you've had your hand up for quite a while. Go ahead, and then we'll get to you, John.
So much to say, so little time. I was surprised to see that guaranteed annual income wasn't in either list one for short term or list two for long terms, and
It
maybe
was
that can be.
was in list two.
Oh, okay.
So universal basic income or decommodified income is the other term that's being used. Go ahead.
Yeah. Number two is there's a fundamental issue of culture that I don't know how to address, and that is why is it that so many poor whites in particular who should have every reason to oppose the kind of economic processes we have in place that marginalize them as well as minorities. And it seems to me that the only way I can ever explain it is that they are all saying, thank God, at least I'm not at the bottom of the economic ladder. There's poor minorities are worse off than I am. And I don't know how to overcome that attitude. And why is it that they continue to politically support legislation and policies that are directly opposed to their interests? So I don't know how, that seems to me to be a cultural issue that we have to overcome. The third thing I wanted to say, and it's a minor point, and that is I read a piece recently, and I can't remember where, unfortunately, that said that not all the people who cross the border in Texas or in Arizona or in Florida are coming from South America or Mexico. Many of those folks are coming from all over the globe, and they're just going there as a place to enter the United States. And I don't know how that enters into the equation.
I believe that people from India are now the third largest national group crossing the southern border, right? So yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I think the question of why working class Americans support the Republican Party, and in particular politicians within the Republican Party who explicitly attack both the tax basis for and the policies that are directly beneficial to them, is a tortured, complicated, extremely important issue. And I think we have to be very careful. I'm very suspicious of explanations that say they're confused and stupid, right?
No,
there's got to be something that makes it make sense for them. And then the idea that we've been talking about for quite a while now, that they are status insecure, that an economy with great inequality produces great status insecurity, status anxiety, and that treating themselves as people who need, quote, government handouts puts them in a category that they don't want to be in, a category that is racialized in our society and about which we have a narrative that suggests that this is the undeserving poor. These are people who aren't willing to work. They would rather just take the dole, and that they therefore end up supporting politicians who, in a sense, support their sense of self-worth, their sense of social standing, their sense of belonging. You're absolutely right. They want to differentiate themselves from, and then it's typically racially coded, people who they don't think deserve what they get. And that's part of, at least, of what's driving the logic of the movement of the working class into the Republican Party, especially under Donald Trump. But I think, again, limits of time, and I want John to, I know he's eager to speak, have a moment to speak as well. We'll have to come back to that topic because that's an incredibly important topic. John, why don't you get the last question for today, or comment, I suspect.
It's actually a question for a future lecture. You're certainly not going to do it today, but getting back to migration, the levels of migration these days coming over the southern border is very unpopular with the majority of American people. when they hear that an awful lot of these people are Chinese and Indians, they're going to be even more against it. Is there an issue for democracy in pursuing policies that are so much opposed by so much of the American public? But don't try to answer it now.
Yeah, and so let me make this a more general question. I've been teaching to my undergraduate Sarah Lawrence the really interesting book by Page and Gillen's Democracy in America ? And part of what they point out is that if we were more responsive democratically to what the majority of Americans' policy preferences are, we would be less liberal as a society. That in fact, at least on social cultural issues, whether that's abortion or women rights or trans rights, or we could keep going down the list, but including immigrant rights, it turns out that the people who benefit from disproportionate influence because they make contributions to our campaigns, the people, and then you could say who make $200,000 a year or more, and then especially the millionaires, tend to be more culturally liberal than average Americans. If we were more democratic, we might be less liberal as a people, including on immigration. And so I completely agree with you, John, that this is a real issue, and that to say, as I just said, that this is in part a narrative that has been accepted because those who are unwilling to pay higher taxes are looking for a scapegoat, and they've found a convenient scapegoat in immigration, doesn't fully address the question: what happens when a large portion of your population has bought into a narrative that scapegoats people who may not be directly responsible? Do you just say, we're not going to listen to you? That's not very democratic. So there is a chicken and egg, a circular problem here. Can we become more democratic without becoming more illiberal? John, go ahead.
Using the word scapegoating totally misrepresents what I was trying to ask. I'm trying to ask about, from a point of view of somebody who believes in democratic principles, what issue does this raise? Not the question of what these people's motives are. I don't think most people are scapegoating it. I think most people don't like a lot of poor foreigners around. They're
Yeah,
not scapegoating it for their own problems. So I think we should do it on a, not with little code words like scapegoating.
so let's continue this conversation when we have more time. I like the idea of doing it, and I like the idea of broadening it to talk not just about immigration, but about the question of whether a more democratic America might be a less liberal America on issues that many of us care about. I think that's a really interesting question, and it is one that I'm thinking about.
Having said that, David, let me
Yeah.
say another topic that interests me that we haven't talked that much about are the prospects for the Democratic Party strategically. And there, just with respect to immigration, I think the question of how Democrats approach the question of immigration, one of the hot button issues in today's politics, is really crucial for the election. But again, that's one maybe for 16 lectures from now, not this current topic. So thanks.
Thank you, John, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to go pack my bags and get on a plane, but it's wonderful to be with you as always. You guys take care, and I'll see you on Zoom next Saturday. Bye, everybody. Thank you. Take care.